You've heard the jokes. Gen Z is too sensitive, glued to their phones, doesn't want to work, and somehow both lazy and burned out at the same time. Anxious snowflakes who crumble under pressure. Right? But what if almost everything you've been told about Gen Z is backwards? Think about it. This is the generation that grew up watching the world melt down in real time. Recessions, school shootings on the news, climate anxiety before they could drive, a global pandemic during their most formative years. If Gen Z seems different, maybe it's not weakness, maybe it's adaptation. So let's bust some myths. The first one you always hear: Gen Z is lazy and entitled, no work ethic, wants success without effort, allergic to the grind. Except, that story falls apart the moment you look closer. Gen Z didn't grow up with the promise that hard work equals stability. They watched their parents hustle and still struggle. So instead of loyalty to one job, they learned something else. Resilience through diversification. Side hustles, freelancing, monetizing skills online, selling art on Etsy, editing videos, flipping sneakers, building brands on TikTok before they're legally adults. That's not laziness. That's survival psychology. When stability disappears, the brain adapts by spreading risk. Psychologists call it adaptive hustle. Gen Z didn't reject work. They rejected being trapped by it. Then there's the big one. They're addicted to screens. Sure, Gen Z grew up with phones in their hands, early Instagram, Snapchat streaks, the FOMO of watching everyone else's highlight reel at 2 a.m. But calling it addiction misses the real story. Gen Z uses screens the way previous generations used garages, notebooks, or basements, as creative labs. They don't just consume content, they build identity through it. Editing videos, remixing sounds, launching memes, running group chats that feel like digital living rooms. Yes, dopamine loops are real. Doom scrolling is real. But so is dopamine literacy. This is the first generation openly talking about dopamine fasting, digital detoxes, and algorithm fatigue before age 25. They don't just feel overstimulated, they can name it. That self-awareness matters. Another favourite myth: Gen Z is socially awkward. Bad at real conversations, can't make eye contact, hides behind screens. But here's the twist. Gen Z didn't lose social skills. They rewrote them. They're fluent in emotional language. They talk about boundaries. They say things like, "I don't have the capacity for that right now," instead of ghosting and pretending everything's fine. That's not awkwardness. That's emotional intelligence shaped by collective trauma. When you grow up watching conflict go viral, you learn to choose safety over performance. Gen Z values depth over small talk. They'd rather have one real conversation than 10 fake ones. And yes, that can look quiet, but it's not emptiness, it's selectivity. Now let's talk about the most damaging myth of all. Gen Z has fragile mental health, anxious, depressed, can't cope. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Gen Z didn't invent mental health struggles. They stopped hiding them. They grew up during what psychologists call collective trauma, constant crisis with no off switch, pandemic Zoom school, graduations cancelled, isolation during years meant for exploration. That does something to a developing nervous system. So Gen Z learned to scan inward early, to name feelings, to normalize therapy, to talk about burnout before it turns into collapse. Is that fragility, or is it early intervention? Previous generations were taught to push through pain silently. Gen Z asks, why are we pretending this is normal? That question alone has reshaped workplaces, schools, and activism. Viral mental health awareness, burnout conversations, redefining productivity. This isn't weakness, it's systemic awareness. And finally, the myth that wraps everything together. Gen Z doesn't want to work. Wrong. They just want work to mean something. Gen Z watched people trade their lives for jobs that replaced them anyway. So purpose became non-negotiable. They're adaptable, not disloyal. They'll work hard, just not blindly. They're willing to learn fast, pivot fast, quit fast, and rebuild fast. That's not lack of ethic. That's evolutionary efficiency. Of course, there are challenges: burnout from hustling too young, anxiety from constant comparison, exhaustion from always being on. Gen Z feels everything intensely, but intensity isn't a flaw, it's fuel when directed. Here's the real twist no one talks about. Gen Z isn't broken. They're calibrated for a world that no longer works the old way. They're emotionally literate in an emotionally chaotic era, digitally fluent in an algorithmic economy, skeptical in a time of empty promises. They don't want to inherit broken systems, they want to redesign them.